And today's seminar I'm really excited about. But before I go any further, I just want to inform people that this session will be recorded, and we will be disseminating this recording across various platforms. So if you don't want to be seen, do feel free to turn your camera off, but do be aware all verbal contributions will obviously be part of the information we disseminate around. Okay, so just so you know that. I know many of you know us, but just to introduce ourselves to those who might not be familiar with us, I'm Hilary Ward. I'm an associate professor in the Veterans and Families Institute, and I also co-direct the professional doctorate in health and social care at Anglia Ruskin University. But I'm here today because I'm part of the perfectly formed Anglia Ruskin University Grounded Theory group. And we consist of groups of people, staff and doctoral students who are all immersed in using grounded theory methodologies. And together we hold seminars such as this, we have reading groups, we have discussion groups, and we've started a few writing groups as well. We run together in a spirit of collective curiosity, and it's with this collective curiosity that I'm really proud to introduce our guest for today. Our guest is Dr. Oliver Thomson, who is the host of the brilliant Words Matter podcast, one podcast that I think all people researching in their own professions should be aware of and should be listening to regularly. But just as a brief introduction to Oliver, Oliver is an associate professor at the University College of Osteopathy and a registered osteopath and clinical director in London. He completed his PhD at the University of Brighton School of Health Professions, where he used constructivist grounded theory to construct an explanatory theory of the clinical decision-making of experienced osteopaths in the UK. Oliver's research interests include grounded theory research, patient-centred care, clinical reasoning decision-making, and clinical manual therapy. Oliver supervises PhD students using grounded theory, qualitative and mixed research methods. As I said, he's the founder of the excellent Words Matter podcast, which has now reached 67 episodes. You also deliver training courses and mentor packages on enhancing patient care through better communication. Wow, that's a great biography, Oliver. Fantastic. So, as we know, for those who follow the podcast, Oliver interviews many influential people in the field of researching in our professions. And today we thought it'd be quite good fun to twist the tables around, and we are going to actually interview Oliver. And to lead the interviews, our host is Nikki, who is one of our doctoral candidates in his 5th year of his doctorate in education studies, and is fully grounded in grounded theory. And Nikki's got a series of questions that he's going to share with Oliver. But also we do have the chat function running. So if we have any thoughts or questions we might want to post to Oliver, do put them in the chat function, and Maria and I will moderate and occasionally put our hands up to interject with their question as needed and as necessary. So without any further ado, I'm handing over to Nikki.
Thank you very much, Hilary, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed, Oliver, because I have to admit it was my mad idea to turn the tables on you, and then I made it even madder by asking some of your interviewees if they have any questions for you. So if you get any particular hard questions, they weren't me, they were your previous guests who are now turning the tables as well. So in your biography, we heard a bit that your PhD was a PhD research was a grounded theory project, and you specifically looked at clinical decision making in experienced osteopaths and therapeutic approaches. So, can you just, as an opening question, why did you choose a grounded theory approach for this project, and then specifically as well, I guess, why did you choose to go constructivist?
Thanks, Nikki. I think as an opening kind of comment, if there's ever a moment of imposter syndrome in my career, it's about now. You know, the imposter syndrome scale. Yeah, I'm humbled. I'm embarrassed. You know, we spoke about, you know, I'm no kind of grounded theory expert, but kind of like many of you, have used the methodology, enjoyed the methodology. But I'm so yeah, I've a bunch of kind of feelings and emotions that are kind of flowing through right now. But so thank you firstly, and thank you so much for following the podcast and promoting it and kind of engaging with it. That's fantastic. That's what it's there for. In terms of thinking back to when I started my PhD, which was, goodness me, it goes to 2009, I think it was 2010, I can't remember. And as you rightly said, I adopted a constructivist grounded theory approach. Your question was, why did I adopt that approach? Well, I mean, like many PhD students, you're influenced by your supervisors. Your supervisors have a particular interest in the methodology. So there's the kind of pragmatic reason of a supervisor is passionate about methodology and they suggest it to you. I think, but I suppose more tied to the research problem was around, I was interested in the variance of practice. So within osteopathy and across healthcare, there's just a real kind of variation in how clinicians approach practice. And you've got, particularly in MSK, musculoskeletal practice, where I'm based, you can go see one physio or osteopath or chiropractor that adopts a completely different therapeutic stance and employs a different range of interventions compared to other clinicians. And that just bothered me. And I thought that was interesting, but annoying. And I wanted to understand what this variation was about, what was motivating this variation, what was driving this variation in practice. And I suppose through kind of discussion and trying to think about the research problem, it seemed to be that this was a social, kind of psychologically orientated process, that how clinicians think about themselves, how they interact with their colleagues, how they interact with their patients, that seemed to be through that, discussion with supervisors and colleagues, adopting a kind of social lens towards that. Your kind of options for methodologies is somewhat, it narrows it down, doesn't it? Because your initial kind of the menu of qual methodologies is vast. And depending on how you're conceptualizing your research problem, kind of it should logically follow, right? So if I was interested in, a particular phenomenon or experience, that would then, it would kind of point me towards a kind of an IPA or a phonological study. But so for me, it was like, okay, I'm interested in how people approach practice. What do clinicians do with practice? Well, they kind of think and they reason and they ultimately make decisions with people. Decision making's a kind of process, isn't it? And so then the question then becomes, well, how can we understand the process of clinicians' decision making? And then we're talking about kind of psychosocial processes. What's a good methodology to explore that? Well, you go through the kind of gambit, TA and IPA and GT and action research. Okay, well, GT has this strong kind of sociological foundation and has been used to look at social processes across healthcare, but organizations and many other areas. And then that's it. So I settled on that. In terms of constructivist, why I settled on constructivist, again, I was influenced by my supervisors. They were like, don't do, Glazerian or classic, or these are the problems. So that's the initial, of course, they said, go away, read them all and make a decision, which ultimately you do. But all of us that go through a PhD, a qualitative PhD, we are rightly made to think about epistemology and ontology and kind of our positions and our views around knowledge and kind of reality. So the minute you're forced to engage, and so for me, it was kind of some modules, postgraduate modules as part of my learning, you go to the classic stuff and it's like, well, it's pretty vacant in terms of epistemology. You've got to presume that it's kind of post-positivist, even though it's not explicit in terms of how it's described. It's like, well, that doesn't seem to sit well with how I'm thinking about the research field and the problem. And so then you say, well, at the time, 2009, Sharmaz's book just came out a few years before. So that was kind of pretty hot and had a much clearer epistemology, which seemed to sit with how I was conceptualizing practice and thinking about qualitative research. I couldn't address the tension between adopting a post-positivist GT and then also adopting a qualitative, kind of multiple truths and pluracy and knowledge and all that stuff.
What would those, so if you think back to that, because this is, I've found these discussions in my, I guess I'm not through yet, but in my initial bits of my doctoral studies, I found these very interesting. How were those discussions taking place between you and your supervisors? What did they think when you said, look, I'm going the Sharmaz route?
So my supervisors, so my kind of main supervisor was not really a grounded theorist, was a professor of physiotherapy, really established and influential, since retired. And I think now is an OB, MB, so really eminent. And so she was kind of agnostic. She wasn't tied to any of it. She's like, you know, I'm here as a kind of, as someone to be more kind of guiding in terms of some of the clinical questions, not so much the methodology. And that she'd supervised like 1,000 PhD students. And so she was really crucial in that respect. The second supervisor, Nikki Petty, who again was a physio, had just finished her prof doc actually using kind of a combination of dimensional analysis with Lenny Schatzman and Sharmaz. And so the discussion was more fruitful with her because she was embedded in constructivism. And I suppose that there were questions like, you know, how are you thinking about knowledge, or like, how do you view practice? And as a clinician, it was because I was tied into my research field, if you like, I just had to think about, well, how do I think about patients, and what are my assumptions around decision-making or knowledge, or what kind of relationships are there to be made with patients? And so it was reflecting on my own clinical work, which got me in touch with my kind of epistemological stance and view. And it's not natural. You still have to try and learn to spell the word. You don't automatically kind of just having an understanding of some of your assumptions, you still got to engage with some difficult ideas. So I think it was just some constantly kind of questioning and reading different people's views. And I'm easily persuaded. I mean, I'm one of those people that will read one article, think I agree with that person. That's my view. And then I read someone else, oh, actually, no, so I'm pretty, you know, I think in those early stages, at least, you know, when you are rightly influential, you kind of bounce between different positions. And then you just find something which naturally seems to sit and is pragmatic. Like, I guess PhDs are also about getting them done, and you can kind of navel gaze for decades and just not adopt a position. You know, pragmatically, I had to pick a generation of grounded theory or version, or I had to match up, or I wasn't brave enough rather to be really out there and creative and, you know, do some kind of post-qualitative iteration of grounded theory, which neither had epistemology. I mean, I just wasn't, I could do it. I wanted to get this thing done, but also engage in some of the philosophy.
I mean, I like the word generation, because I picked that up from your podcast episode with Mills and Burke, because they talk about generations of grounded theory rather than variants of flavors. And I think if we look at it from a timeline perspective, that's probably true. So did you find it hard to come to a philosophical position, and did your philosophical position remain stable once you settled on something? Did it remain the same, or did it still change throughout the latter stages of your PhD?
I mean, I think it probably crystallized a bit more because it had to. So, you know, I know that as I was approaching the kind of finishing line, so to speak, and you're kind of writing your thesis, you've got your defense in mind, how you're going to articulate your position. If anything, you become more dogmatic in a way, in so much as you've got to clearly explain that position. You've got to know the weaknesses, you've got to recognize some of the flaws in that position. But I think going into Viva being uncertain about my position wouldn't necessarily have done me much good. You know, so I was strategic. I mean, it's not, you know, I'm not saying I played this game, but I also recognized, okay, I've got to hold a position here. I've got to, which seems to be congruent with how I'm kind of thinking about the world. And so this, you know, constructivism seems to fit as well as any other one. I'm going to run with that. And, you know, if I was going to do my PhD again and start, where would I sit? I don't know. Like, I didn't really engage much with kind of critical positions in my PhD. It was just a bit scary, kind of Foucault. I couldn't really pronounce Foucault. The T just threw me. And I was like, well, I can't really, maybe critical. So I suppose in hindsight, I could have possibly explored different positions. But, you know, I read a bit about kind of the critical paradigm, but then, you know, simply you kind of go one end of interpretivism, the other end of positivism, and it's a kind of wrongly a dichotomy. So I probably didn't engage with the kind of more nuanced positions, which I kind of subsequently am aware of now, which is maybe a good thing. I didn't get kind of completely embedded in that, but yeah. So
knowing that now, then being give or take nearly a decade post PhD, and having these additional influences and some more time to bash these things out, and I think supervise some grounded theory students in your own right. How do you now view knowledge and your assumptions of beliefs? And more importantly, because I think this is the key thing for most doctoral students, is how do you make this explicit?
Yeah, it's difficult. I'm still now torn. So I'm in healthcare, and I'm in a part of healthcare where evidence-based practice, which is kind of largely a kind of positivist movement, where it seems to kind of hierarchy certain types of knowledge and says, right, this knowledge is reliable and good, and the kind of other stuff, kind of anecdote, narrative, isn't a kind of reliable or good. So I'm in this kind of weird position where I'm an advocate of evidence-based practice and think evidence is a good thing to utilize and to incorporate, but some of the foundational assumptions around EBM don't sit well with constructivism. So I'm playing both sides. I don't quite know how I do that. I mean, I haven't figured out how I'm not going to contradict myself. So, and again, I kind of lost your question, but I certainly, it's still, my position now is, I suppose you just become a bit braver to challenge some of these things, like, but all the same, I'm still pretty fickle. Like, I'll kind of move between positions, and I think at my core, being in healthcare, I recognize that the person I'm interacting with, the patient, has a unique perspective on their illness experience, their kind of social environment, social context. And once I adopt that, once I appreciate that, it's very hard to move away from constructivism or an interpretivist view of practice or reality. So I'm kind of bound. The minute I guess if I became an engineer or an architect, I could more easily kind of shake off the constructivist position, but I'm just interested in individuals and their experience. And so I can't really not adopt a constructivist position, I think.
And I think the tension is real. I mean, as a veterinary scientist come grounded theorist myself, it's a mad balance to find that in a day job, I'm an evidence-based practitioner and I teach evidence-based practice, and then I go do a doctorate on the side. And then that the notion of what evidence is just completely changes. And you're completely right in that that particular positive approach to evidence is not always helpful, particularly when we look at people's experiences and those kind of more, should we say, less measurable aspects of
immeasurable. You can say they're just not measurable.
Yeah.
And I think so, just on that point, I think the Cause Health series, the 16 episodes, which I did with a bunch of kind of philosophers, clinicians that seem to have been grappling with stuff, that I suppose that's the key, that it's the kind of traditional form of EBM is kind of drenched in positivism and it doesn't sit well, whereas a different view around causation seems to sit, it embraces qualitative research. There isn't a dichotomy there, a kind of artificial or a tension there.
We keep dancing around the podcast, mainly because there's so many useful aspects of that. So if we just link it to one specific episode now, because this was one that I found, or one series, I guess, because there were multiple episodes around the same theme. And some that I know resonated for a lot of people in our group is you did a podcast episode on clinicians divorced from their professions, which episode 1 was probably the most bravest of the whole podcast, because that's where you interviewed yourself and where you talked about yourself as a divorced clinician, and then there were a few others. But if we look at that from a grounded theory perspective, do you think that grounded theory can come more natural or can be more useful to outsiders to their profession, just because you're going to do this research and that in itself will infer that there is something in the current status quo that you're not happy with and that you feel warrants further research? So does that kind of then put you outside of your profession, I guess? So does grounded theory fit better in people who consider themselves outsiders, in your opinion?
I think that's a good question. I mean, I don't know if there's anything particular about grounded theory that an outsider, insider, I think it's research or qualitative research more broadly. I suppose me labeling myself as an outsider is really just perhaps overthinking how I relate to my profession, and I think that all research, having that, I suppose that comes from, questioning and what's the word, kind of really kind of questioning your own assumptions and givens as a PhD student. Like that was well drilled into me. That's a skill that I learned, to really kind of question everything that I thought was true, and taking that into clinical practice. You can't shake off that disposition. You just become critical of yourself, critical of your colleagues, or at least critical of your profession. So in terms of whether that lends itself, I think you're right in terms of being bothered by things. And in my case, I just get probably overly annoyed and overly bothered, and which I've constantly got to try and rein in. But I think just seeing, like initially those years ago, being bothered by the variation in practice. I'm bothered by other things now, but they become research questions, don't they? They become, it's curious the way the world is, or the way the professions are. That's a great place from which research questions are constructed. So I think, having a kind of critically reflexive position puts you as an outsider, because it's not an automatic stance. I mean, those of us in healthcare, we have colleagues which just walk through practice in a kind of, as I said, like a dreamlike state. Like, it's just everything is fine. And why are you thinking so deeply about this stuff? Why are you so bothered about this stuff? It just goes unnoticed. But as a researcher, when you put a researcher hat on, these things, they go. Your job is to notice them and then to try and understand them. So again, I'm a terrible podcast guest. I've always said I'm a better host than a guest, but I haven't answered your question. Oh, we lost Nikki.
He's on. Have we lost Nikki?
Yeah, I can't see him.
Oh my goodness. Maybe his connection has dropped or something. I'll jump in the meantime then, Oliver, whilst Nikki gets this question back in. That really intrigued me. That kind of what you were just saying there about. One of the questions I've got here is something to do with that tension is real statement that was just made there. And this idea that as a grounded theorist, and like you, I go across lots of different qualitative methodologies. I'm not wedded to grounded theory by any means, but I do tend to find that it makes me question things slightly different to my peers, colleagues, and others. And I'm just wondering if there's a position where you become too wedded with a way of thinking as a grounded theorist. That could perhaps blind us to other ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think seeing everything as a grounded theory study. I mean, you do, don't you? When you've got to really immerse yourself in the methodology, and you've got to understand it, you've got to live it, you embody the methodology. And I think, again, you have to do that but to doing that as part of a PhD kind of program, that makes sense. Like, you really want to convey. I mean, it serves both kind of practical utility, like you just become better, you get better techniques, you understand what coding is and memorizing and these kind of the technical side of things. But again, it comes back to writing this story, I suppose, rendering the story around grounded theory and how you utilized it, being able to communicate it, showing those expertise in the Viva. Like, you've got to convince your examiners that you've really kind of learned something here, and you've kind of mastered to some extent a methodology. I think when I stepped out kind of postdoc and you start to see the world, it's not as you spending 6 months thinking about a sentence on grounded theory just doesn't map out to funded research where it's more pragmatic, quick and dirty. Like, there just isn't the time for that kind of navel gazing. I think it's necessary doing a PhD because it really it makes you more robust as a methodologist or researcher. But I think postdoc you can see problems different. You can ask. I think it just gives you more flexibility in the way that you view research problems.
Yeah, I would concur with that, actually. And I think you're right. There is a difference between doing it as part of your PhD doctoral studies and doing it in funded research. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The term you used there was mastering grounded theory. And I'm just wondering if you could give us some clues about how it is we go about learning to master the process through grounded theory, sort of starting from this idea of we go into the field quite open, with that sort of critical questioning of assumptions and things, and just talking us through the process of how we start from that initial early type coding through moving through to the more theoretical sampling.
Yeah, so again, the way that I've used it and some students have used it is just that, is to be kind of as open as you can, not obviously going to the field with an empty head, you're not a blank slate, but you can't help but be sensitive to the things that you might be interesting or salient to your research question. I suppose what I liked about the Sharma's approach was that looking at, you mentioned coding, it was a pretty I think there's 3 types of coding. There's like initial, I like that. I think it could be advanced, I forget, and there's some in vivo coding, but you look at the kind of Strauss and Corbin, the Corbian kind of coding paradigm, it's confusing, didn't get it. And I quite quickly thought, this just seems too hard. Not too hard, but this just seems overly complicated. Clearly, I read the arguments against that approach, whether it's by Anthony Bryant, or I forget the name of another researcher in the US that just kind of criticized that approach. And I seem to agree with those criticisms. So quite early on, I kind of, and on reflection now, I wasn't as, even though I certainly, my PhD was certainly grounded theory, that I'm reasonably sure of. But in terms of the actual techniques, yes, I line by line coded. Yes, memos was really important, but some of the coding, it's so intricate, and maybe it's the same with all PhD, that the ultimate thesis is a slightly, it's a rendered version. It's messier in real life. It's just messy, and it's much more organic, and it's serendipitous, and it's probably more deductive reasoning than we would care to admit. Findings just seem to kind of make sense or crop up serendipitously. So I think immersing myself in the data really, and I would listen to interviews, and you go to bed and you'd be listening, you hear these voices, and you'd be a real bore to family members. And just, I look back now and think, what a weirdo. Why was I so interested in these people's stories, and how did my wife, what if she must have thought, I was so, but you really immerse yourself. And then I suppose the theoretical sampling, it comes from that. So you've got to, I guess theoretical sampling is obviously different from purposeful sampling. You're sampling based on your developing theory. So you're having to have reflective pauses during your analysis, take a moment's breath, talk about your findings with your supervisor, say, right, what's happening here? What are the main kind of issues which are cropping up? And what data do you need to try and address some of those questions? Which these are questions that you didn't know at the beginning of the study. They're brand new, so to speak. I mean, they might have been in there somewhere, but nonetheless, they were hitherto unexplored or unnoticed by you. And so, and that was, so yeah, and just not just thinking about who am I going to speak to, but for me in my PhD, it was, well, what kind of data might be helpful here? And so I went from doing just interviews with participants, with osteopaths, talking to them about their reasoning, what's their clinical approach, all that kind of stuff. And then it became apparent that this is quite hard to articulate in many cases, that much of practice is kind of embedded in action, or rather much of knowledge is embedded in action. Like they didn't really know why they're doing what they're doing, they just kind of do it. So then we kind of looked at some different methods of data collection. We settled on some observation. We thought by me observing, sitting in a clinical room, watching clinical interactions between patient and clinician, that would be one way of going about some data. And so we thought, okay, we'll do some observation. Then I had more of a read around, looked at video recording, and thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could video record? But then what you do with the video recording, how do you treat that data? Is that like an accurate portrayal of the event? That doesn't seem to sit. The notion of kind of looking at data didn't seem to sit. It's kind of a bit objectivist and didn't seem to work. So what I decided to go is to use the video, because that was a powerful tool to initiate some reflection in the interview. So we'd record the sessions after the session. So I was in the room, sensitive, trying to hide in a corner, more so not to kind of just, distract the clinician. And then we would watch the video recording on an iPad. And I look back now, I used an iPad to record, and back, in those days, iPads were like the size of a cinema screen. It was just plonked on a desk, looking at the, and I just done it anyway. Don't know what I was thinking, but got through ethics. Then anyway, we would watch the video recording, the participant and I, and it was so powerful. We could watch it together, and it was weird for them because they've never seen this whole practice. It's like an hour recording or 45-minute recording, but really insightful for them. And I would pause and say, listen, what was going on there? And some of the questions, this was a different set of questions this is based on the developing theory. So I knew kind of the areas I wanted some data on. So it was completely, but largely led by the theory. What kind of stuff do I need to find to fill in these gaps, to kind of enhance the explanatory power? And so I not only just chose which participants to in my case, either re-interview or interview to observe and video record an interview for the first time, but also some I went back to. So that decision was based on the developing theory. What kind of data do I need? So I really enjoyed that. It took a lot of time, and it's tiring, and it's I think some of the undergrads I supervise, they never get there. The theoretical sampling, it just takes a lot of thinking, but if you can do it, it's wonderful.
Thanks for sharing that, Oliver, because what it shows is the creativity that can be brought about in a grounded theory type study, because you're led by what you found before.
Yeah.
So
which is mad. I mean,
that.
if you say it's a quantitative researcher, they're just like, well, this doesn't make sense. I mean, it's just this is the most bar. And how is it the case that the researcher can almost presuppose the answer and then go and find data to prove it? Seems crazy in a kind of positive sense. But sorry.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I know Nikki is back with us now, so welcome back, Nikki. But I'm going to let Nikki pick the questions back up, but there is just one I'd like to slide in at some point, and that is your thoughts on the term emergent.
Sure, okay.
Before we give you that beauty, then, just to I guess follow on from what Hilary just said about the creativity in grounded theory. I think that process that you went through your PhD also very much highlights the flexibility of grounded theory as a methodology, and how it can cope with a wide range of data collection methods, from interviews, which most people seem to think are the standard, but also to then alternative sources of information, whether they be written or not. And in your case, in effect, it was video elicitation and using video as a source of discussion, which is, as far as creative goes, I mean, it might be a big iPad, but iPads apparently are very creative tools, if you have to believe the marketing. So that's brilliant stuff. So we've talked a bit about theoretical sampling and how you experienced that, and how you went through that. So if I mean, I guess now is as good as any for a question like that. So what do you feel, or what are your thoughts on what emergent means in a grounded theory context? What is emerging data?
I mean, I think, when I was in my PhD, we had a grounded theory interest group just like you at Brighton, and it was led by Professor Nursing, Julie Scholes, who was my examiner, actually, funny enough. So she was a full-on grounded theorist. I made sure to read her thesis before my Viva, and I wasn't, her thesis, I wasn't shy of being inspired by the way that she used grounded theory. Let's put it that way. But so she organised a talk with, she organised Barney Glazer to come on this great big screen at one of these workshops at Brighton, and I just remember his head was the size like a full-on like kind of cinema screen, just head of Barney. I don't know how they managed to get Barney in to speak, because you hear about he's kind of cantankerous, he's not the most approachable, but anyway, he was fine. I asked him, and we all got to. He gave a little presentation, I think, and we could ask him a question. So I remember standing up. I must have been my second or third year of my PhD, and I asked him, and I said, I've got to write this chapter. I've got to write this chapter about my epistemological position. What should I write if I adopt a kind of Glazerian classic approach? Getting him to commit to positivism at least, and articulate a kind of post-positivist position around. He didn't. He kind of deflected and talked about something else, as I think is typical of him. But in terms of emergence, right? I mean, that's how I took. I think looking at how grounded theory came about, it seemed to be the case that this stuff just jumped out. That the theory was there to be found, and if you just went through the process, particularly the constant comparative method of analysis, which obviously Glaser really advocated for, it would just happen. Like it was just a bit like, I don't know, which is an automatic process. And so that's what I took it to mean, that it would just if you followed the steps, you didn't really need to think about how it happens or the interaction between participant and researcher and data, researcher and their own social context. It will just happen. A kind of a bit of a mantra. So I took it to be that, and that just didn't seem to make sense for me. I started to read around constructivism, the critiques of Glaser, and I probably, in fairness and hindsight, I didn't really steelman Glaserian grounded theory. I could have probably been a bit more charitable to it. I was just like, that sounds ridiculous, that everyone's saying how bad it is. In hindsight, I could have been fairer in my criticism and actually read works. I did dip into his grounded theory press or sociology press, like he had his own publishing company, and I dipped into that, and that was pretty not that helpful. Again, it was just them, the authors repeating his kind of mantra. So no, I took it to mean just a kind of passive appearance of data meaning, that meaning resides within the actual words of participants rather than the researcher placing meaning on the data.
So following on from that then, because I think that if we then take that through the grounded theory process, and we've had this emergence or not, depending on how you look at grounded theory, and in the end, the outcome of your grounded theory study is a theory that explains that basic social process, that phenomena. But then you go into your viva, and then you get questions on it. So one of the things that we take and that we understand as a good quality grounded theory is a grounded theory that's independent of time, person, place, etc. But how did you experience having to evidence that your theory was independent of time, person, place, or transferable?
Yeah, so I don't know if it was independent. I think, it's that level of abstraction that you get with GT, that if you can kind of really fly above and, you can think about or write about your data, which isn't tied to time, place, and whatever. I don't think I got there. I remember reading I mentioned my examiner, Julie Scholes. I read her PhD. She was looking at critical care nursing. That was it. I think decision-making around ICU nurses. And she brought in lobsters into... She used the metaphor of lobsters and there were different, the hard shell of crustaceans, and like this really interesting, really abstract way of talking about decision-making in nursing. That I can see I don't think it was formal theory, but certainly it was more abstract than what I generated. So I don't know if I did reach that level of abstraction. It was certainly more than just qualitative description, explain the variance of data. It gave some underpinning kind of antecedent conditions. So yeah, I don't know how transferable my work is. I suppose on that, what subsequently has happened in the last couple of years from an undergrad student said, I really like your theory on decision-making. Can I turn it into a questionnaire? And subsequently we're developing the questionnaire, which that's published a second paper, which begins to, my supervisor would cringe at the fact that I'm developing a questionnaire, but it's quite interesting to begin to think, okay, well, this theory, which does seem to have some transferability, how can we look at that? How can we test that? And if you're going to make we can do a similar qual study in a different context, but developing a questionnaire has been, beginning to create statements around some of the categories has been really interesting to begin to measure some of the dimensions of practice. So yeah, I wouldn't, if you told me 10 years ago, you're going to be doing questionnaire design, I'd be like, no way, like that's the devil's work. Now I'm actually really enjoying it. And so coming back, I think, to Hillary's question, it's just, I'm more epistemologically flexible. I'm not so wedded. I'm kind of enjoy the work. I love grounded theory. I am a qualitative researcher, but also other things are interesting too.
But isn't that the whole point though? So, because you say, and I had to giggle when you said your supervisor would cringe, but isn't the whole point of following up from grounded theory and the theory being developed is that theory then gets tested, and then one of the means of testing that theory is by asking lots of people for which. So I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. You fill a gap, you make a theory, and then people run with that theory, and obviously it has some form of grab because otherwise people have forgotten about it.
And I suppose it's how you view theory. So and I don't know, but I've got a sense that Glaser, if he was still alive, would probably say that grounded theory has the ability to predict within itself, given its level of abstraction and the kind of process, who needs to do a cross-sectional survey to try and test this theory, that you might verify it through, there's kind of inbuilt mechanisms, I think. So I think that would be his view. I mean, I don't know, it could be completely wrong, but I think some would say that the theory in itself, a good grounded theory wouldn't necessarily need that quantitative testing, that if it's abstract enough and explanatory enough, then that should be it. I'm imagining there are some people that hold those views. I'm not sure, actually.
Possibly. I'm not quite sure whether that kind of position still holds in the modern day research world, because, I mean, as you said earlier, I mean, a good researcher questions everything, including that. And that questioning is part of why we do research and how we find out whether things change over time. And I think that, again, I mean, what do we mean by the term theory? I mean, in essence, the theory, it's just something that explains a process. How does something happen? So again, we've just going to be a bit full circle, because you started of your PhD as a grounded theorist, and then over time you've done that more. You've branched out throughout your podcast with a range of interviews with various people, and we've talked briefly, and you've mentioned a few times briefly already that your views on research and on knowledge and epistemology have somewhat changed over time, and throughout this interview you've already said a couple of times that in hindsight maybe I should have. So you're still wrestling with questions from day one, as you should, I guess. How has the podcast and in particular that qualitative research series influenced your view on and potentially your approach to grounded theory? Are you now seeing things differently because you've been exposed to a wide range of experts in the field?
So good question. So I think, I mean, the podcast, as I look, as I think now, and as we obviously spoke before this, but thinking about how the podcast is and how I relate to it, I mean, it's kind of like a GT study. I don't know what the research question is, but it's got this, it really just follows my interest, my theoretical sensitivity, for want of a word. Like, what are the key problems? What's interesting me? So each episode is this kind of interview, this period of data generation, which there's no final theory to be produced, but I'm just thinking what motivates me to speak to people about various things, of which it's certainly not monetary, it's a free access, it's, everyone can listen to it, there's no financial kind of motivation. I'm just curious. I'm thinking, why do I bother with this? Do something else. But I think it's part of that, just wanting to understand, or just being curious in people's positions, people's kind of expertise, trying to just figure the world out, or at least the kind of social healthcare world. I think your question was, how has the podcast changed my view of grounded theory? I mean, I can speak directly to the episode with Melanie Burks and Jane Mills, and how that, so I think with that conversation I was super nervous, goddesses of grounded theory, read their books, so really was keen to speak to them. I think a couple of things surprised me was, how can I say this? Particularly with Melanie, I think I asked a question around, if you just intend to do grounded theory or produce a theory but don't quite get there, is it a grounded theory study? It seemed to me from her answer that no, the true test of a grounded theory study is whether you end up with the theory in the first place, at the end point. So that she was quite strong with that. And I'm perhaps a bit more flexible. I'm like, well, you can go through, you can employ the techniques, you can kind of really live and breathe grounded theory and not necessarily get there. I was a bit more flexible with the use of, I think it'd be fair to say you adopted a grounded theory approach or method, but you didn't. So maybe we're kind of arm wrestling about whether a study is grounded theory in its methodology or produces a grounded theory at the end. So I mean, I suppose that episode got me thinking about how I thought about grounded theory. No, I still think it's a very, very fine technique. Like I'm a proud, if it's a powerful methodology. I think the podcast has solidified, the fact that so much of who we are and what we are is kind of context sensitive and socially sensitive. The grounded theory kind of lends itself to exploring those. So the podcast hasn't really changed my view. I'm still kind of bound to it as a qualitative methodology. I've never done IPA. I've done a bit of TA, but to me, it has the coding approaches, the focus on process. I think that's the thing that really I think is really useful, rather than just describing social phenomena. It looks to understand the processes which underpin those, and that seems to be somewhat interesting about GT.
Do you think it's fair to say, and I mean, Hilary just put it in the chat, and I've had this question pop up a few times throughout in your qualitative research series. Is it fair to say that most qualitative research uses, to some degree, some of the methods laid out in grounded theory?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know most or many or some. Yeah, I mean, I think, when I'm not doing whatever not doing grounded theory quality research is, but when my aim isn't to develop a theory, I cannot, what's the best way to conceptualize data, or not the best way, what's a way that is meaningful to me to conceptualize data? I can't turn off that kind of grounded theory lens. Is it sensible to do some data collection, some analysis, data collection, or should I just do a bunch of data collection and then just leave all the analysis at the end? That seems both inefficient in terms of time, and also you're missing some kind of opportunities to develop good data or good findings. So I think, there are some just good practices built in within GT, which can be applied to all qual methodologies, or most qual methodologies, and which, if I'm supervising students which aren't doing kind of full-blown GT, I will certainly, it kind of looks a bit like a GT study, because I will ask, students that will do 13 interviews and not do any analysis. That's just a missed chance to generate some interesting data. So I think you're right. I think either intentionally or unintentionally, grounded theory methods, techniques have kind of bled into many corners of qual research.
I think we've got a couple of questions in the chat from the audience. So question from Amanda, who asked, can grounded theory apply to ethnography?
That's a good question. I remember I spoke to Fiona Webster, who's an ethnographer in Canada, and it seems to me, and I'm no ethnographer, that you could certainly, as we said, you could certainly utilize. I mean, I suppose in my PhD, I kind of used, was it ethnography? I don't know. I sat in a room and was interested in observing people interact. So it's a form of ethnography. So, and I guess what I'm not clear about is how you say I'm adopting an ethnographic approach, but then also utilizing grounded theory methods to develop a grounded theory. Something has to give, right? You're either adopting ethnographic methods of data collection, for example, and maybe positioning yourself as an ethnographer and holding some of those values. But then I'm not sure how you have to blend those two, which doesn't seem difficult, but I don't think you can say this is both an methodologically ethnographic and it's methodologically grounded theory. I think one has to give, I think. But what does everyone else think?
Hilary just absolutely read my mind, which is a bit scary, but I think what comes from this, and probably also from the previous question on that I asked you, is that there is a distinction, and we must make the distinction between methodology and methods, and method being the techniques that you use to do research, and methodology being the philosophical underpinnings. So the techniques will probably be very much similar across all methodologies. It's then more about how do you use them and why do you use them in that way. So, I mean, interviewing and coding and doing observations and coding observations, all that sort of stuff, they're all technical things.
Yeah, and I suppose what might be, which I'm not clear about, is both ethnography and grounded theory methodologically interested in process and the social world. So, and I'm not good enough at, I don't know enough about ethnography to say, well, there's a particular difference about how the focus or the gaze of an ethnographer is different to a grounded theorist. To me, it's just all social processes. But ethnographers say, actually, no, we're actually looking at a different aspect of social interaction. But given that that's something that's quite common between the two, like I said, I think you can generate grounded theory whilst utilizing ethnographic methods of data collection and some positionality too, I'm imagining.
Yeah. So I guess then one of the a bit of a rounding up question, I guess, from me, knowing what you know now, considering and this is always a hindsight question and is always very difficult, and you hinted on it a few times already, knowing what you know now, having supervised your own students, having talked to some very influential grounded theorists, having done your PhD, survived your Viva, be a clinician, insider researcher, outsider, are there things that you would do differently? Would you still go, for example, for grounded theory and constructivist grounded theory? Would you have used different methods?
It's a really good question. I think probably just developing the two examples I gave, one was I would have probably, rather than just be easily convinced about constructivist grounded theory, I could have, as I said, kind of steelmanned, what is wrong epistemologically with, why don't I just do Glazerian or classic grounded theory? And just explore that more. I still think I made the right choice. I think epistemologically, constructivist grounded theory makes far more sense. As a PhD student, it's much easier. Like you can write about constructivism. It kind of logically follows to Sharmaz's work. I think that was I wouldn't change the fact that I chose constructivism, but I think I probably would have done both sides, or the other side, kind of justice, and really explored that and engaged with it a bit more. I kind of dipped in, I read Discovery, I didn't read Awareness of Dying or Time for Dying, so it's really early work. So I think maybe I could have explored Stillman, Glazerian grounded theory. It sounds terrible, so I wouldn't do anything differently. It kind of got me to where it got me. It was I was fortunate enough to have a good Viva, some really kind of nice examiners or interested examiners, which didn't kind of kill me. I think, what would I do differently? No, I can't think. Isn't that terrible? I can't think of anything I would do differently. There was another example I did give about, one was exploring Glazerian, and the second one was, I can't remember what it was now. I forget. But no, I don't think so. I don't think I would do anything differently.
You've mentioned Stillman grounded theory a few times, and it kind of timed it quite right this time around, because there was a question came in through the chat from Javina about she's had some interesting discussions at a GT conference, and there are still purist Glazerian grounded theorists out there who still holds that anything but doing it the Barney way is not grounded theory. I mean, what would your response to that be?
Yeah, and I remember what I was going to say back in time with this one now. I think one thing that I did go into my PhD, I thought I really want to gain some expertise in a particular methodology. So I just, for both for postdoc career development, my own kind of just finding the PhD process easier. So I kind of really consumed GT literature. I was like, right, I've just got to learn and know GT. And I remember emailing, there's a researcher, this is the same guy I mentioned before, there was a name that kept on cropping up that wrote loads of abstracts around grounded theory that seemed to be published, some journal papers, also just some abstracts that were kind of published conference proceedings. loads of stuff around GT, which didn't seem to appear in the main journals. I remember emailing him. He was in like Iowa, somewhere, in the kind of middle part of America, and so can I have some papers? I was really passionate and obsessed about learning GT. So I think one thing that I think is helpful as a PhD student is, whilst I said I should be more open, perhaps consider other methodologies, all that kind of stuff, I think there's also something about really gaining some skills and kind of developing some strong expertise in a particular methodology, and just saying, I'm really good at this, and I've really learned this, and future career opportunities, this, and almost, maybe you box yourself as a grounded theorist, but I think for me, I was like, right, I just want to be really good at this. So I read lots around that. Your second question, or your actual question, was around what I thought about people that still hold strong Blazarian approaches, or...
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I'm quoting from this here, to say that apparently anything that is not Barney's way, so for example, constructivist grounded theory is a dishonest application and erosion of grounded theory. I mean, those are very strong words to say about something that has been very popular for a very long time.
I think if your view is that the kind of knowledge and reality is stable, that nothing changes, that how grounded theory was described in 67 should be exactly the way it's described now, then that's completely right. Like, it's true. I mean, the person's correct. If you say, well, actually, kind of meanings change, social context change, knowledge is unstable, reality is unstable, and actually there's a plurality of ways to think about grounded theory. And I know Antti Bryant talks about kind of family resemblances and when does grounded theory not be grounded theory? We spoke a bit about that with Melanie and Jane. I think there does come a point where it just doesn't seem to fit the category of grounded theory. I don't know what that point is. But I think that's a kind of naive position to take, and I'm not quite sure, to try and time encapsulate grounded theory as it was in 67 or that period, and just have no influence from kind of current developments in epistemology or ontology or kind of general kind of methodology, just doesn't seem to work in any aspect of whether it's professional. If we were going to time encapsulate medicine, what is a GP now? Is it, thinking about what GPs were in the 60s and the way that they're interacting with patients and some of the methods that they draw upon and their view of themselves in relation to their profession and relation. I mean, this all changes and it's all up for grabs as we move. So I don't quite know what that's about, but I don't subscribe to it.
I don't think it's something that holds in modern science and research, that position. We're nearing the end of our 1 hour slot, so I'm going to round up briefly. Thank you very, very much for talking to me, Oliver. It was actually felt like a really interesting discussion that we probably could go on for hours, because there's so much to talk about grounded theory wise. But I think this in itself and doing these kind of discussions are helpful. We learn from each other. And I think you don't do yourself enough service when you say, because you mentioned it very much at the start, imposter syndrome, et cetera, but the effect and outreach you have through social media and through the podcast are phenomenal. And I think that in itself is very much worthy of celebrating. So yes, I mean, of course, we all have imposter syndrome to a certain degree, but I think in this case, it's a very well-deserved thank you. And yeah, in this case, in this context, you are most definitely the right person to talk to all of us. Thank you. Hilary, would you like to round up as chair for this session?
Absolutely. Oliver, thank you so much. That was an insightful and honest thoroughfare through grounded theory. I love the terms you use and bringing forward the idea of creativity within grounded theory. Your data takes you to where you're going to next. That spirit of openness and questioning, of not having those overarching controlling theories that direct so much of research. And that constant curiosity and questioning, I think, is refreshing. And I echo what Nikki says. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing and for your podcasts. I know our PhD students, doctoral students, and doctoral students everywhere are gaining from the work I do. And as somebody who's using research, and I do grounded theory research in funded research, I am often found in a coffee shop punching the air going, yes. So thank you so much, Oliver. Really
Thank you.
appreciated your time, and I hope you've enjoyed spending the last hour with us.
It was great. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for your kind words and enthusiasm. And yeah, it's great to hear. You never really get much feedback. You can put the episodes out there and people might message you over social media saying really liked it, but it's great to, you know, really is warming to see that it's helping and helping people, or people are engaging with it. So thank you.
Oh no, it is. It's so lived because it's real and it's honest. So yeah, we can't recommend it highly enough across all of our doctoral programs.